Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Free Press live stream. My name is Rafaela. I'm the executive producer of Honestly with Barry Weiss, and I'm here joined by Jed Rubenfeld and Matt Continetti. Jed is a Free Press columnist and a constitutional law professor at Yale. His podcast is Straight Down the Middle, and he recently wrote for the Free Press, Is Trump's Takeover of DC Lawful? Matt is the director of domestic policy studies at AEI. His latest book is The Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatism. And of course, you'll know him also as a Free Press columnist. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
Before we dive in, I just want to say to listeners who are tuning in, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And the producers will try to send as many as possible to me, and I will put them to our guests. Okay, so diving right in, yesterday, Trump said he was placing DC's police under federal control and also deploying 800 National Guard troops to the city, saying our capital city has been overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of wild youth, drugged out maniacs, and homeless people. That was his characterization. We'll get into the question of if this response is the right one and if it's necessary. And if it will be effective. But first, I sort of want to understand if these actions are legal. So I'd like to start with you. And I sort of want to parse out, there's of course the question of, but then also the question of federalizing the DC police force. So let's start with the police force. Are his actions legal and why?
Well, it's a funny thing about the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., nation's capital. It's governed differently from any place else in the country. If Trump were trying to do this in Los Angeles or Chicago, there's absolutely no way he could do it. And everybody would be outraged that the President of the United States was trying to, they would be correctly outraged, the President of the United States trying to take armed control over the police. But Washington, D.C. is different. In Washington, the Constitution vests legal authority over DC in Congress. Congress is like the legislature for DC. And until like 50 years ago, every single DC law was passed by Congress. Now, about 50 years ago, Congress passed a statute called the Home Rule Act, giving DC local government and local self-governance. But that statute has a bunch of serious qualifications in it. And one of them, Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, is directly relevant here. It says that the president, whenever he determines that special conditions of an emergency nature, I'm quoting the statute, exist that make the use of the police needed for federal purposes, he can seize control of the DC police force. That Home Rule Act vests control over the DC police force in the mayor, but that Section 740 says president can take it and the mayor has to give it to him if he so determines. Well, that's what he's done. He has made that determination and he says, okay, now you got to give me control of the police force. So that's, you know, at a first cut where things stand.
Basically, the DC Attorney General is saying that there's no crime emergency and that Trump's actions are unprecedented, unnecessary, and unlawful. What case does he have for it being, or him making the case that it's unlawful?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. Well, you know, a lot of people are outraged. It's very unusual, but I got to tell you, from my point of view, looking at the statute and the Constitution, everything else, I think Trump's pretty much well within his legal authority here. Here's the thing. A lot of people are talking about, well, is there really a crime emergency in the District of Columbia, as Trump says? But and we can get into that a little later, like what the crime stats are, but the statute doesn't really say that that emergency has to exist. It's a very important legal point. There are some statutes that give emergency power to the President of the United States, but under those statutes, the emergency has to exist. And only if it exists does the president have these special powers. This statute I'm talking about, Section 740, is different. It says whenever the president determines that special conditions, you know, exist, he can exert this power. That's the way you write a statute if you're Congress, if you want to give the president maximum discretion. It says to judges, look, the statute's saying that president makes this determination. And so that judgment's pretty much left up to him under the statute. So if there's any judicial review here, it is going to be very deferential. President has exerted this authority. The statute says it's up to him. He's done it. Then you got this question of whether he is really using the police for federal purposes, which the statute kind of suggests he has to do. And some people are out there saying, no, he's just using it for local law enforcement, protecting Washington, D.C. citizens. That's local. That's not federal. But what Trump is saying, he phrased his executive order very intelligently. It says, no, this violent crime, the extent of it, is threatening the functioning of the federal government. It's threatening federal employees, federal officials. It's impeding the function of the federal government itself. And that is, pretty clearly a federal purpose. He says, I'm doing this to protect the federal government's functioning. That's a federal purpose. So it looks to me like he is within his authority, unusual, though it is what he's done. I don't think any president has ever taken over the DC police force without the cooperation of the DC mayor. So this is unusual, but it looks to me like the statute does authorize it.
Well, I'll just pick up the question about the 30-year statistic. You hear that bandied about quite a bit from opponents of the president's decision. This statistic has kind of weaved its way into the mainstream media, but without much context. Right now, there's an ongoing investigation about whether some of the data, whether the crime data has been falsified in the District of Columbia. And in fact, there has been officers who have been put on leave because of allegations that the books have been cooked, so to speak, in order to get crime numbers down. Now, that said, overall, there seems to have been a decline in crime nationwide, and it would make sense that overall decline in crime would also affect the District of Columbia. But I'd also say to the people citing this 30-year statistic, you have to remember 30 years ago was 1995. And in 1995, crime in DC was terrible, was still awful. So even if we've gotten back to the level of where we were 30 years ago, the crime in DC is nothing to brag about. It's nothing to be satisfied with. And secondly, the statistics don't necessarily account for social disorder. So if you go to the CVS or the drugstore in Washington, D.C., most of the products are always behind glass. If you walk the streets of D.C., as I do every day, you see that there are roaming homeless people, usually under severe mental duress, screaming at passersby, harassing them, aggressive panhandling. And then, of course, we've had just in the past several months high-profile acts of violence. There was a congressional intern who was killed in the District of Columbia earlier this year, a tragic story. And then in the story that may have caught the president's attention, one of Elon Musk's Doge staffers, a young man who came to the Capitol to help create efficiencies in the federal government, was attacked, assaulted when he tried to intervene in a carjacking in the early morning. So one, take these statistics with a grain of salt, I would say, but two, also be aware that they don't fully capture kind of social disorder. And finally, it is this sense of social disorder that I think the public reacts to. Just a couple months ago, the Washington Post released a poll asking DC residents, whether they thought crime or personal security was a serious problem. Overwhelming majority said it was a very serious or extremely serious problem. That number had gone down year on year, but it was still somewhere in a vicinity of 60%. So I think Trump is reacting to a problem that he identifies. I think most people living in the district, whether they will admit to it or not right now, identify, and that it's a political dilemma, I think, for Trump's opponents to be in a position where they're somehow saying that crime is not a problem in DC, when everyone with common sense understands that it is.
Just to add a little context to the numbers, I thought there was a really good piece in the Washington Post by Megan McArdle. And basically she says something to the extent of, last year DC had 187 homicides. So that's about 27 for every 100,000 residents, which was this 32% drop. But then she goes on to say, that's not to say that it's not a problem. That's still very bad and it's not good. And she gave the comparative numbers of in Boston, it was 3.7 homicides per 100. This is compared to the 27 that I just mentioned. New York was 4.7, Los Angeles 7.1, all in the same time frame. And on top of that, a lot of people out of Trump's administration have asserted that, look, they think DC is cooking the numbers and actually underreporting. And so to put that question to you, do you think there's any truth to that there is underreporting, or how should we think about that claim?
Well, I think we should take it seriously, given that this investigation is ongoing. There was a very good report on this subject in the Washington Free Beacon today by Alana Goodman. So I think there's overall, we're finding that there are problems with government data, and there are reasons to take government data skeptically. And I would always say that when you're trying to contrast the data with people's experience, how they feel, do they feel safe at night? Do they go out and walk more than a few blocks late at night? Take the people's experience first, because arguing with statistics does not actually have the same impact, I think, on people's mentalities as the stories that we've all heard, or people who live or work in the district or around the district have all experienced and known. So, yeah, I think there's reason to look into those claims. But just one final point about going back to what Jed was saying. Trump is very skilled at identifying places where Congress has delegated authority to the president over the decades and locating these places in the law and then seizing on them and using them. And in this particular case, I think Trump has long been disturbed by the fact that if someone takes the train into Washington, D.C., the first thing they see is urban decay. The first thing they see are homeless people at Union Station. They often encounter graffiti on Union Station or in the statuary nearby. If they drive through the city, as Trump does regularly, they're going to see the tent encampments. And I think throughout his 2 terms, he's been bothered by this. It's a sign of how effective this second administration is that they were able to go back to the Home Rule Act, and they're able to say, oh, look, this clause of the statute gives you the ability to federalize the MPD, the DC Police Department, for 30 days. And when Trump sees a power that's been delegated to him, he's going to take it.
Jed, you basically made the case, that despite this talk of the crime statistics being X or being Y, it's kind of all irrelevant to the question of can he do this? Can you put a little meat on those bones on why that's sort of a separate conversation from his ability to move forward?
Yeah, sure. Let me first, though, just reiterate what you guys are both saying, just so your listeners are clear about this. Even if you accept the data coming out of DC about the crime rate, this is just what you were saying before, Raphael. So the 2024 data that's coming out, whether they're underreporting or not, is apparently showing 27 deaths per 100,000, 27 homicides per 100,000 people in DC. That's the decreased number. So you got all these, major media outlets that are focusing on this decrease. There's no crime emergency. It's lower than it was in 2023. But I don't know that the decrease is really the story here. 27 per 100,000. It's, listeners really need to understand how high that is. That's an alarming number. It's just what you were saying before, Raphael. So the White House is saying that is 6 times higher than the homicide rate in New York City. They're saying that is 3 times higher than the homicide rate in Islamabad, Pakistan. I mean, it's just not acceptable. And, I don't know why the crime rate did come down, if it did come down from 2023, but it is not acceptable in our nation's capital or anywhere in the country for that many homicides to be happening. It's just, that's crazy. And so, and this is what Matt is saying, it is a very shrewd political move for Trump to come in and say, I'm going to clean this up because, nobody should have to live with this. Nobody should have to live with this kind of, anxiety and other violent crime is, homicide is just one kind of violent crime. There's carjacking and assaults and rapes. And, people should not have to live with this. And if the local governments can't get it done, well, I have this special power in Washington to do it, and I'm going to get it done. So now you're asking the question again, well, legally speaking, do we need to unpack or put it this way? Does a court need to get behind and make a decision about the actual data? What really, what's the real rate of homicides in Washington? Is a court going to review that and decide that in order to decide if what Trump's doing is lawful? I don't think so. I don't think a court's going to get into that. And the reason, once again, is that the statute doesn't say that there has to exist a proven crime emergency, it has to, what it says is if the president determines that special conditions exist of an emergency nature, but it's up to him. If the president so determines, then he can exert power over the DC police force. That's the kind of language that gives the president tons of deference. I think courts will give him tons of deference. So they'll say, you know, you're coming forward saying crime has decreased. That's not really the issue here. Has the president made that determination? Yes, he has. That's probably going to do it.
So assuming it seems like we're all on the same page of that crime is a serious issue, what does this actually look like on the ground for Trump to control the police? And I'll add, like, who's in charge? What's the chain of command here? And I'll add, you know, we haven't touched as much on the National Guard question, but do they have similar authorization to detain people in the way that police officers do? I think a lot of people are just confused about how this will actually work operationally.
I can say a word about that. You want me to start?
Either.
Okay,
You
so
go ahead,
first,
Ted.
okay, thanks, Matt. So first of all, what Trump has done is he's delegated his authority, as he is permitted to do, to his Attorney General, Pam Bondi. She in turn has delegated it to a special person going to take charge of the police. That's all. That's all okay. That's fine. You know, the National Guard question that you're raising right now may be the most important one because, you know, even the mayor of DC hasn't been saying, hey, crime is down, so it's no problem anymore. The way some of these media outlets and some other Democrats are saying. Mayor of DC, Mayor Bowser, she's been saying, yeah, crime is down, but we have a serious crime problem. We need 500 more officers. Trump bringing in these National Guardsmen to act as more police officers might really be the thing that makes the most difference of all. Just putting some more patrolmen out there and some more officers, adding to the essentially adding to the police force. Now, is that lawful? Again, if DC were anywhere else, it would not be. Trump couldn't do that on his own. Anywhere else in the country, the National Guard is under the control of a state governor, unless and until the National Guard is called up into federal service. And even when the National Guard's called up into federal service, well, even then, the Guard is not permitted to act as a police force and just do normal law enforcement. There's a federal statute. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act. And it says, nope, National Guard called up into federal service. They can't, don't start thinking they're a police force that could detain people, just do law enforcement. They cannot. But none of that applies in DC. In DC, there's no governor. And the Home Rule Act doesn't purport to say that the National Guard is controlled by the mayor. No, everybody understands, pretty much universally understood, that the president has control of DC's National Guard, which has 2,000 or 3,000 active members in it. So he's allowed to just directly call them up into service. And that limitation on not using them as a police force, that appears also not to apply in DC. So he can immediately bolster the DC police force with quite a few extra officers. That 800 is going to make a big difference, probably, and he could even do more. So it does appear to be lawful, and it may be the most effective thing that he could do to try to crack down on violent crime.
I think Mayor Bowser's reaction has been very interesting. In her Trump's first term, she was much more combative toward the president. In this term, she's taken a very different approach, and I think it's been a successful one. And so it's not just on this crime issue where she has acknowledged that there's a problem. She has admitted that legally there is very little she could do, even if she wanted to stop this. But she's also been working with Trump, of course, on the new stadium for the Washington Commanders and the redevelopment of that area to the east of the Capitol. And I think she understands that there are many factors at play here, and that on the issue of crime and personal safety, this is not the hill for Democrats to die on. This is not the hill for Democrats to somehow say there is no problem, or that we need to be more solicitous of the criminals rather than the victims. And interestingly enough, you know, Trump has taken this drastic action, and it's an unprecedented action. But only a few years ago, Trump's predecessor also intervened in the DC criminal justice system. There was a city council plan, a very controversial one, to reduce penalties on crime and juvenile crime even further than the city council has already done. And the newly Republican House of Representatives, and then at the time the Senate was under control of the Democrats, passed a resolution, because Congress controls the District of Columbia, overturning that city council criminal justice bill. President Biden signed it. And at that time, when President Biden was saying the crime is already bad in DC, we don't want to make it even worse by incentivizing criminals through lessened penalties, there was nary a protest. Trump does it, again, a much more drastic action, but he has kind of divided the Democrats, where you have people like Bowser on the one hand saying, look, I'm working with the administration. I don't want to press the envelope here. We'll figure something out. And then you have the national Democrats who have reacted to this story as though the long dark night of fascism is about to descend on the United States.
One, I think, legitimate criticism, not the one about fascism necessarily, but a different one is, look, I understand the problem, but this is not the right approach. Taking over the police and deploying the National Guard. And, to follow the criticism through, they'd say more resources for the DC police, better recruitment strategies, making sure that criminals who are caught are actually prosecuted and not just let back out. And that this whole sort of episode is a bit of showmanship, but it's not actually getting to the deeper issue that will solve crime in a more long-term and fulfilled way. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, I think it's a fair argument, but what I think it assumes is that the incumbent parties, the DC government, would be willing to take such drastic reforms if Trump weren't there to shake the cage. That's what Trump does. He rattles the cages. It's the same thing when you look about the powers that he's asserted with the universities. He is able to rattle the cage. He's able to get some type of motion and response, and potentially, say, take Columbia University, a settlement that may lead to reform and reduced harassment of Jewish students. But in order for there to be a lasting solution, you need the institutions themselves to take further responsibility, right? And in this case, I think what you would need is Congress to actually step up. Right. So in the case of making sure that the DC MPD recruits more police and deploys them in the right forces, this is, I think, an argument for the Congress to revive the control board, which is what they used during a previous period of DC disarray in the 1990s, after then Mayor Marion Barry was, of course, arrested for drug use and then was reelected. The Republican Congress, led by Newt Gingrich as Speaker, created the DC Control Board, which essentially ran most of the District of Columbia for the rest of Mayor Barry's second term and into his successor's term as well. Congress could do something similar. So if Congress takes this opportunity to kind of step up and say, okay, well, Trump has asserted this emergency rule for 30 days, but we want to kind of lay the foundation for better reforms by creating a new control board, by directing the District of Columbia to devote resources in certain areas, to fund more police as long as we know that they're going to be on the beat and not behind a desk. I think that'd be a long-term solution. But in America today, we focus on the not just on the short term, but on the really short term.
Does that seem politically feasible? Do you see that happening?
Well, I think it would be a great move for the Republicans. I definitely see a bill going through the House very easily. The question then would be, would legislation like this require 60 votes in the Senate? But even there, this would split the Democrats. I mean, and we've seen, again, in the previous Congress that there are Democrats who are willing to take crime seriously in D.C., national Democrats. This is the issue, though. Once a policy like this, whether it is the university's anti-Semitism, whether it is immigration and enforcement, or whether it is crime in the District of Columbia, once the issue intersects with the personality of Donald Trump, it's harder to reach bipartisan agreement.
Well, going into the midterms, it seems like bipartisan action and Democrats crossing the aisle would be favorable to them. But
Absolutely.
We'll see. I want to get into the question of timeline, which, Jed, you wrote about. It was very interesting what you said. Basically, and you'll tell me if this characterization is accurate, but within the confines of Section 740, which is basically allowed Trump to take control of DC police, he basically has this 30-day window unless Congress chooses to extend it. Can you basically walk us through that 30-day window, how he might eventually extend it without Congress, and how the timeline can look different?
Sure. So Section 740 does have this 30-day kind of set in stone maximum period for presidential takeovers of the DC police force. So I'll just say right there, so everybody understands, that has nothing to do with the National Guard. There's no 30-day limit on his use of the National Guard. This is so he can do that for longer if he chooses. But for this takeover, this federal takeover of the DC police force, the statute says 30 days. Now, if he wants to go longer, we don't know that he does, but what he's trying to accomplish seems like it would take longer. Does he have any options for extending it? Yeah, he's got two options. One is the first thing you said. Section 740 allows a joint resolution, House and Senate, to authorize a longer presidential takeover of the police force. Problem there is that kind of resolution probably does require 60 votes, probably can be filibustered. There are other sections of the Home Rule Act that allow Congress to do stuff with no filibuster. So there are sections that actually block the filibuster, but this one doesn't have that. So can Trump, can his Republican allies in the Senate get 60 votes to extend the president's takeover of the police force? I kind of doubt they can, because the Democrats can be saying this is authoritarian, it's fascist, we don't go along with it. Is there anything else Trump can do? Well, there is an option. I'm not saying it's a super strong one, but he could let the 30-day period lapse. He could hand the police force back to the mayor, and then the next day he could issue another executive order saying, okay, I determine once again that the violent crime emergency exists and that police are needed for federal purposes. So I'm doing another 30-day takeover right now. And he could, in theory, he could re-up that way. Now, I guarantee you there would be litigation over that. And I think there's a decent chance a federal court might disallow that and might say no. You got to factor in some considerations here too. Does Trump really want to do that? One, there is a political consideration here that folks are not focusing on now, which is what happens if, murders occur over the next 30 days, 60 days, 90 days in DC? What if the crime rate doesn't go down? Trump takes this over. He owns it. Federal government takes over the police in DC, brings the National Guard, and there's still murders. He owns it. All of a sudden, crime happens in DC and there's homeless people in DC and crime happens. It's not the president. You can say, well, that's the mayor. That's their problem. He owns it after, if he does a long-term takeover. So maybe he doesn't want to do a long-term takeover of the police. Well, we'll just have to see. We don't know yet if he does. And we just have to see how that, would play out.
So basically what you're saying is after each 30-day cycle, he could do new EO indefinitely, forever.
If I'm a judge, I'm not really sure I'm going to go along with that. But
hypothetically,
the statute doesn't say that he can only do it once. The statute doesn't say that, 2 months from now, he couldn't do it again. So the statute doesn't say 30 days and then the president can only do it once during his administration. It doesn't say anything like that. On the other hand, judges are going to look a little skeptically here. Wait, this statute, it gives you a 30-day maximum period. You're trying to circumvent that. You're trying to get around that by, this trick of letting it lapse and then re-upping your authority. I could imagine some DC district court judges saying, no, we're not going to let the president get away with that. But the statute on its face does not block it.
Matt, assuming he does act in this 30-day window, what do you think is realistic that he can accomplish in just 30 days? It's such a short period of time.
Right. Well, I think what the administration is going to try to highlight is increased arrests during this period. They're also going to want to show increased visibility of law enforcement. They were very quick out of the gate, even before the announcement, to show these federal agents, the ICE agents, the DEA agents who were kind of patrolling the mall over the weekend. So you'll see images, I think, from the administration of National Guard troops, for example, positioned in places where there are tourists or where there's a lot of business traffic. And it will be that sort of kind of racking up wins, which is a big part of the ethos of the Trump second term. They're going to want to have things that they can show. Well, we increased the arrest rate, or we were able to close more homicide cases, or the shootings are down in this month. But as Jed says, I mean, this is a gamble. And I think it's a risk in the sort of hyperactive government that we've experienced in the second Trump term. the president has been talking a lot about how he's going to do for DC what he did for the southern border. But, these are two different cases. I happen to think that what the administration has accomplished on the southern border is remarkable. I mean, it is incredible. And many people said it couldn't be done, the Republicans and Democrats, but he did accomplish it. But shutting down the southern border and dealing with DC's crime problem, which has been endemic. I mean, as someone who grew up across the river in Virginia, Jed, of course, DC native, we know. I mean, this city has never recovered from the 1968 riots. It just never has. And the social and economic and criminological fallout from 1968 persists to this day. It's going to be hard to correct that in 1 month. So Trump does kind of set himself up for evaluation. And, you can do one thing well with government, but when the government tries to do everything well, it often doesn't succeed.
The southern border comparison is interesting. Another interesting comparison came from Chris Rufo on Twitter, and he basically said Trump has the opportunity to do a Bukele-style crackdown on DC crime. I'm quoting him. The question is whether he has the will and whether the public has the stomach. Of course, he's referring to El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, who became really famous for making El Salvador safe by mass incarcerating droves of gang members. And some people really respected it. Other people thought it was too cruel. I don't want to get into the specifics of what happened in El Salvador, but it was an interesting comparison. And my question to you is, does our system of government, our checks and balances, really allow Trump to act in the same way that Bukele did? And even if it did, is that sort of extreme crackdown something we would want? I mean, a lot of people on the right seem to want that, but I want to put that to you.
Well,
I'll let the law professor take it first.
Well, so there's, legal protections, constitutional protections that would, stop. They don't just apply to police. They apply to National Guard. They apply to ICE agents. They apply to anybody, any federal officer that is deployed. There's Fourth Amendment protections that say you cannot detain somebody even temporarily, even for 10 minutes without reasonable suspicion. You cannot detain them for longer without probable cause to believe that they've committed a crime. We don't allow roundups of suspicious looking people and throwing them all in jail, which is a very effective tool of law enforcement. That is unconstitutional. It is not permitted in the United States. So you got these legal protections that right away would stop a United States president from doing stuff that is done in Latin American countries to clean up the streets. The other thing you got to remember is this is not so much legal maybe as political. Americans probably don't want to see soldiers in great numbers with the kind of weaponry that soldiers carry in soldiers' uniforms, patrolling their streets in large numbers or in their parks in large numbers. Now, Americans, I think by and large, not everybody, but by and large are okay with police, with armed police. That's not true in every country, but in America, we're used to that. Lots of Americans feel the police are there to protect them. Not everybody, but lots of them. And I don't think Americans would object if, you added 500 more police to the streets of any major city or the District of Columbia. I think they'd like that. But do Americans want to see tanks rolling down the street? Do they want to see soldiers with that kind of gear and that kind of hardware, that kind of weaponry? Do they want to see them patrolling streets, even if it does make things safer? I don't think that's a look that is going to be helpful to the president and that's going to be acceptable for a long period of time. So you got two considerations: constitutional protections, which are very important, and this other kind of more political consideration.
Yeah, all I'd add is that the president should be looking closer to home for an example, and indeed he should be looking to one of his close friends. I mean, it's not Bukele that we should be emulating. We should be taking the same approach to urban crime that the Giuliani administration took in New York beginning in 1994, which led to the most incredible reductions in violent crime in America's largest city and a complete renaissance for this city. Of course, New York's going in the opposite direction, and Rudy Giuliani is not held in the same esteem as he was during the 90s and then after 9/11. But I think this is an example that President Trump has in mind because he's a New Yorker and he lived through the pre and post Giuliani era. and he knows Rudy Giuliani, and now he's effectively set himself up as the Washington, D.C. police commissioner. So rather than kind of imitating what Bukele has done, which I completely agree with Jed, goes against the entire grain of not only American history, but also American constitutional law and criminal justice procedure, you should be trying to find out where the criminals are. They know where the criminals are. Make sure that you flood those neighborhoods with police. You want to have visible presence of police officers to reassure the public. And then you want to really crack down on the juveniles. And this is one reason I think that the statistics mask the feeling of disorder and fear many DC residents and visitors feel, which is that we're in the midst of this spate of kind of juvenile crime, a juvenile crime wave. They're not tried as adults. The judges let them off, but they are responsible for whether it's assaults or wildings or carjackings or just a general sense of chaos. So you want to be able to target that. If you kind of stick to those goals, which have been realized in the past, I think you could have a pretty successful period here. If you kind of try to go the full Bukele, I think it's going to backfire and not work out.
We'll have to have both of you back with Chris Rufo to debate that one further. I do want to bring in some listener questions, and just a reminder to people tuning in to send. So let me start with one. There are reportedly plans to send FBI to patrol the streets at night. I'll add on, I think when people hear that, they think, oh, it feels like a little Hoover-esque. Jed, can you tell us about this? Is it legal? And well, I'll leave it at that. Is it legal?
Yeah, it's very largely legal. The FBI is under presidential control. Ultimately, they have the powers of they have powers of law enforcement. They can make arrests. So I'm pretty sure he can do it. The reason why I'm introducing some question in my mind about it is the FBI normally can only arrest folks for violating federal law. And as I'm sitting here, I am not sure whether DC criminal law is considered federal law for FBI purposes. DC law is, could be viewed as local law, not federal law. On the other hand, because DC is under control of Congress, it might count as federal law. I'm sorry to say I don't actually know the answer to that. But one thing I will say is about the FBI is, I've heard other folks make this point, and there might be some truth in it. The FBI agents don't normally patrol. They don't normally act like regular police officers, walking a beat patrolling. What they normally do is when they've got somebody they want to go after, they send, a couple cars and 6 guys and make it, and, they secure the scene and make arrests with a significant show of force. If you're asking FBI agents to just act like regular policemen, which I think is lawful, although with that one question I raised about it, I'm not sure how well I'm not sure how well they're trained for it and how well it's going to sit with them. But I believe I believe it's lawful for the president to bring in all kinds of different federal agents to help with this. And it may be that the most important thing he can do is to bring a few hundred, maybe 1,000 more bodies on the streets of DC to help enforce the law.
I'll pull in another listener question that I think can be somewhat related. A lot of people are asking or saying, the crime they see is not particularly organized in the way that the FBI would be useful for. It's rather, the next logical step of poverty, mental health illness, homelessness, and, deploying the FBI or pulling in the National Guard or taking control of the DC police force doesn't address, or at least maybe not so obviously, maybe you'll disagree with me, but address these underlying root issues of mental health, homelessness, poverty, and so forth. How are you both thinking about the long-term solution? Because I think a lot of people say okay, maybe this gets it under control for now, but it's not so long-term because it's not looking at root cause.
Well, when violent crime is concerned, I don't think of root causes. I think the most important thing is to apprehend the criminal and make sure that they can't commit another crime again. I think the root cause argument has a little bit more valence when we're discussing the homelessness problem in DC, which is tied up in what we've been talking about throughout the live stream, because Trump, as I've mentioned, is very much opposed to these tent encampments that we have throughout the city. He wants to see them go away. Doug Burgum, the Secretary of the Interior, was at the press conference yesterday and talked about the role that the park police in DC has been playing in cleaning up some of these homelessness encampments. Now, homelessness is a very sticky problem because so many of the homeless suffer from mental illness or severe substance abuse problems. And Sally Sattel, my colleague at AEI, has a wonderful piece on this subject in the Free Press just today that I urge everybody to read. But the homeless also have constitutional rights. And the way in which we have set up the system, incorrectly in my view, but this is the way it works, is that it's very hard to make people leave the streets if they don't want to. You can try to relocate them, but they'll come back if they're not confined involuntarily, and it's very hard to have involuntary confinement for mental health reasons in America today. So there's another area where the expectations can be raised so high that it's almost inevitable that you underdeliver. And if you're any administration, including the Trump administration, you don't want to be in that sort of position.
A few different listeners are asking why now. Of course, we spoke about the Doge staffer who experienced the carjacking, and both of your comments on these people just live in DC and they're seeing this on the street every day. I think this more cynical view that I've seen on Twitter is that this is some big distraction from other domestic policy failures or not failures, depending on how you look at it. That's the cynical critique. And so with all of those different points in mind, answer the listeners that are asking why right now?
Well, I think the simplest answer is that this is an issue that Trump campaigned on. You can go back and look at Trump's speeches throughout the 2024 campaign, beginning even before the caucuses and primaries in 2023, where he talks about how he's going to be the law and order president, how he's going to clean up, his words, America's cities. He even raised the prospect of federalizing some aspects of law enforcement using the National Guard, as of course he just did a couple months ago in Los Angeles, in order to fight social disorder and chaos. So this is a longstanding principle of Trump, so to speak. Now the question is, why did he do it on an August Monday? I really am always reluctant to speculate on Trump's motivations. I think it's possible he was triggered, so to speak, by the assault on the Doge staffer. I've said he's always kind of had this resentment of the conditions of the city and a desire to see them improved. And it's also, it may sound flippant, but for Trump, it's something to do. He is so active that even when he has 30 things on his plate, even as he said yesterday at the press conference, he's going to see Vladimir Putin at the end of this week. His question is always, what am I going to do today? So it's let's tackle this problem today. And tomorrow, Wednesday, I'm going to go to the Kennedy Center and talk about renovating the Kennedy Center. There's this constant motion and action. And it seems that we just kind of landed on it's time to take over DC Day yesterday.
A few closers as we come up on time. Jed, basically in the piece, you have this line that's something to the extent of, Trump seems to be well within his legal authority for now. What would take him out of the legal authority space and into not within the realm of legal authority as we look forward?
We've talked about it a little bit already. So that for now that I was emphasizing in the pieces, it's time limited. I mean, he's got 30 days. And after that, it's really a question whether he can keep control over the DC police force after that. You got to remember, Trump is so good at taking over the news cycle and doing so in a way that really puts his opponents on the back foot. I mean, he's got the Democrats who are opposing him saying there's no crime problem in DC. This is the point that Matt was making before. I mean, he has provoked a reaction that is embarrassing for them, doesn't look good for them. And if he succeeds in significantly reducing violent crime in DC, it is a huge, huge win. I mean, but you got to hand it to the guy. He takes over the news cycle. just when, everybody is trying to, he's always got people on their back feet. Everybody's always, responding to what he's put onto the front page. And he seems to just brilliantly do that. I'm just speaking, I'm a law guy, not a politics guy, but he seems to just do it over and over.
And some of this posturing about potentially taking this model to other cities like Chicago, how does that fit in?
That's a completely different thing. I mean, the president has no authority to take over the Chicago police force. And if he tries to bring in the National Guard, like he did in LA, you instantly have this question about, well, he could use the National Guard if he appropriately calls them into service, but he can use it only to protect like federal facilities, post offices, federal, maybe federally insured banks, federal buildings, federal facilities. If he tries to bring in the National Guard to do law enforcement, get rid of the homeless, I mean, that's a hugely problematic thing. What he's doing in DC is not going to translate easily at all to other cities. And so, no, nobody should judge from the DC experience and how the courts deal with that to what could happen elsewhere.
Looking at the big picture. Oh, sorry, Matt, did you want to jump in before?
No, I completely agree with Jed. It's not transferable. He may have had in his head what happened in Los Angeles, but then that was a response to the disorder, the riots there over the anti-ICE protests. And then, of course, the National Guard was limited in its role in precisely the ways that Jed said. So I think that was something that kind of Trump mused about, but is unlikely to happen.
Looking at the big picture, and we've touched on this a little bit, a lot of Americans don't want to see National Guard on the street necessarily. It feels not like us as Americans. It feels like some other country somewhere else. Obviously people will say it rings of authoritarianism. People will debate that. The question I have, we've established that it's within his legal realm, might even be justified given the status of crime in DC. But in your opinion, does it feel like too much of a power grab? Or does it feel right given the moment?
Well, I think that the real story of Trump, too, is that the president has been using tools that progressives have established and have used for decades, but no Republican president has until now. And so this is another case where the extraordinary delegations of power by the United States Congress to the president is something that Democratic progressive presidents have used willingly, enthusiastically in the past. But Republican presidents have had much more a complicated relationship to, not Trump. And so I don't describe this as a power grab because the power was there and he's decided to exercise it. And as we've been talking about throughout this hour, it seems like this is a lawful exercise of that power. But I do understand the worries or just the discomfort or kind of confusion about National Guard on the streets of the United States. We have to remember that it was the quartering of British troops, which was part of our constitutional rebellion. It's saying that will not be permitted under the Constitution, and one of the causes of the American Revolution, which we're celebrating this year and into next year, was this kind of over-militarization of governance that the British applied when the colonies started to get out of line and when the British Crown needed to repay or refill its coffers after the 7 Years' War. So I can understand that. At the same time, I will say, just on a personal level, I remember when the National Guard were kind of called in after 9/11. I was living in New York at the time, and you would visit Penn Station or LaGuardia, and you would see National Guard there. And I have to say, I felt reassured. And I didn't have any qualms about it. And so I think this, too, will be something that people debate if they have a sense of security coming out of these policies, rather than a sense that, well, this was just another performative act by a president who talks a big game, but at the end of the day, nothing really changes.
Jed, do you want to weigh in?
Some of it's going to depend on how National Guardsmen and other federal officers that Trump brings in, how they behave. If they start, you heard Trump's rhetoric. He's like, they can do whatever they want. I'm not going to put any restrictions. If they listen to that and start, doing mass sweep arrests or throwing people against walls or throwing people down onto the ground without any like reasonable suspicion, you're going to have a real problem. But I don't think that's going to happen. There's no reason to think that's going to happen. But if they behave like El Salvadoran police, you are going to have an uprising. That will be unconstitutional, and Americans, I don't think, will put up with it. But I'm with Matt on this. If they behave respectfully and people just feel that they have additional security and they can walk in streets for the first time, that's a very different story.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Judd Rubenfeld, Matt Continetti, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in. Judd's piece, which just published today, is called "Is Trump's Takeover of DC Lawful?" I encourage everyone to go read it, and we'll have to have you back at the 30-day mark to see how it all nets out. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raphael.